I want to talk to you tonight about pricing, but before you tune out and decide this doesn't apply to you because you don't run a business, I want you to sit tight, because this isn't really about invoices and rate cards. This is about a mindset that shows up in exactly one kind of person and is almost completely absent in another, and it explains more about who ends up wealthy and who ends up scraping by than almost anything else I've studied in 40 years of watching people build careers. Here's the sentence I want you to carry out of here tonight. Charge like you're booked out for 6 months. Not because you actually are. Most of you aren't, and I'm not asking you to lie about your calendar. I'm asking you to price your time, your skill, your work, the way a person prices it when they know, with total confidence, that their time is scarce and in demand, because the moment you start pricing yourself that way, something remarkable happens. You start becoming that person. The confidence doesn't follow the demand. 9 times out of 10, the demand follows the confidence. Now let me tell you what almost everybody does instead, because I want you to recognize it, and I suspect a few of you are going to recognize it in your own life tonight whether you want to or not. Most people price themselves like they're desperate for the next job to come in. They quote low because they're afraid the person will walk away. They add extras for free because they're afraid to ask for what the extra is actually worth. They discount before anybody even asks for a discount, just to get the deal moving, just to feel a little safer about next month's bills. And here's the tragedy of it, that fear-based pricing doesn't just cost you money on that one job. It costs you something much bigger. It trains the market around you, and it trains your own mind to treat you as replaceable, as available, as somebody whose time isn't worth protecting. And once that reputation sets in, whether it's with clients or with an employer or with your own family's expectations of your time, it becomes very, very hard to reverse. People price you the way you first taught them to price you, and most people, without ever realizing it, spend their entire working lives training the world to underpay them. Let me put some real numbers on this so you can see exactly what it costs. Say you're doing work, could be freelance, could be a trade, could be consulting, doesn't matter what industry, and you're pricing yourself 20% below what somebody with total confidence in their own scarcity would charge for the same work. 20% doesn't sound dramatic. It sounds almost reasonable, doesn't it? A modest discount to stay competitive. But run that 20% across a year of income. If you'd otherwise be earning $60,000 a year from that work at full, confident pricing, that 20% discount is costing you $12,000 a year. Not once. Every single year, for as long as the patent holds. Over 10 years, that's $120,000, and I haven't even factored in what that money could have been doing for you if it had been invested instead of never earned in the first place. $120,000 is not a rounding error. That is a house down payment. That is a child's college education. That is the difference between retiring on your own terms and working past the age you wanted to, and the entire cause of it, in more cases than you believe, is not a lack of skill. It's a habit of pricing yourself like you're worried nobody else wants what you have. Now, why does the booked out for 6 months mindset actually work? Because it changes the position you negotiate from, and negotiating position, more than almost anything else, determines outcome. A person who believes, even quietly to themselves, that they have room for one more client this month negotiates like someone who needs the deal. Their voice changes. They soften. They add things without being asked. A person who genuinely believes, or has trained themselves to act as though they believe, that they are already 6 months out negotiates completely differently. They don't need to convince anybody of anything. The work either fits into the calendar at the stated price, or it doesn't, and that's simply a fact, not a negotiation. And here's what's strange about human psychology, something I've watched play out in boardrooms and kitchen tables alike. Scarcity, real or perceived, doesn't just change how you present yourself. People on the other side of the table can feel it, even when they can't name what they're feeling. Confidence rooted in genuine scarcity reads as credibility. Desperation, no matter how well it's dressed up, reads as desperation, and people price accordingly on both sides of that equation, almost every single time. Let me tell you about a man I'll call Curtis Bellamy, though I've changed the name because the lesson matters more than the man. Curtis was a Finnish carpenter, one of the best I've ever personally seen work with his hands, the kind of trim work and custom cabinetry that makes a homeowner stop in the doorway. For the first 9 years of running his own small operation, Curtis priced every job the way most tradesmen do. He'd look at the job, do the math on materials and hours, add what felt like a fair margin, and quote it, usually a little lower than he's got told him if the client hesitated even slightly. He stayed busy, technically. He was never without work. But he told me later he was also never without money worry, because staying busy at thin margins is its own kind of trap. You're working constantly and somehow still one slow month away from trouble. I met Curtis at a Home Builders Association dinner where I'd been asked to speak, and during the reception he told me about his business, mostly with a kind of tired pride, the pride of a man who knows he's good at what he does but can't understand why it hasn't translated into the life he pictured when he started. I asked him one question. I said, Curtis, when's the last time a client hesitated on your price and you held it anyway, without dropping a dollar? He thought about it for a genuinely long time, longer than I expected, and finally said, Jim, I don't think that's ever happened. Every single time somebody's paused on a number, I've moved it. Every time. 9 years. I told Curtis about the 6 months booked mindset right there at that dinner, and I gave him one very specific instruction, because vague advice doesn't change behavior, only specific instructions do. I told him, for your next estimate, I want you to write the number you'd normally quote, and then I want you to add 15% to it, and I want you to deliver that number the exact same way you deliver a number you weren't worried about at all. Flat, calm, no over-explaining, no rushing to justify it before anybody's even asked you to. If they push back, you can explain your value. But you do not apologize for the number before a single objection has even been raised. Curtis told me later he almost didn't do it. He said the morning of that next estimate, sitting in his truck outside the client's house, he nearly talked himself back down to his old number 3 separate times before he even walked up the driveway. He didn't talk himself down. He delivered the new number, flat and calm, the way I told him to, and the client paused, a long pause, Curtis said, long enough that his stomach dropped, and then said, okay, when can you start? That was it. No negotiation. No argument. The pause wasn't rejection. It was just a homeowner doing math, the same way anybody does math when they hear a number, and the 15% Curtis had been too afraid to ask for in 9 years turned out to be well within what the client had already budgeted for the work. Curtis told me afterward he sat in his truck in that same driveway for a solid 2 minutes just trying to process what had happened, because in his mind, he had spent 9 years assuming that number would end the conversation, and it turned out it had never once been tested. Curtis didn't stop there, and this is the part of his story I want you to really hear. He didn't just raise that one price and go back to his old pattern. He took the 15% increase and made it his new floor, on every job, permanently, and within 8 months he raised it again. Within 2 years, Curtis was doing roughly the same number of jobs he'd always done, sometimes fewer, because he'd started turning down jobs that didn't fit his new pricing, and taking home nearly double what he'd taken home working at full capacity under his old numbers. I asked him once what changed inside him, because the skill hadn't changed, the hands hadn't gotten better, the work was identical to what he'd been doing for 9 years before that dinner. He said, Jim, I stopped pricing like a guy who needed the next job. I started pricing like a guy who already had one. And it turns out, once I did that, I usually did have one, because I wasn't taking every job that came along just to fill the calendar with anything at all. I want you to sit with what Curtis said, because it's the whole lesson wrapped into one sentence. He stopped pricing like a guy who needed the next job and started pricing like a guy who already had one. Nothing about his actual skill changed in that transition. Nothing about the market changed. The entire shift happened inside his own mind first, in the way he held himself before a single word was said to a client, and the market simply responded to what he was already projecting. That's the part almost nobody believes until they've lived it themselves. The confidence doesn't arrive after the proof. In almost every case I've studied, the confidence has to come first, uncomfortably, before there's any proof at all, and the proof only shows up once somebody's been brave enough to act as though it already exists. So let's talk about what this looks like for you, starting with your very next invoice, your very next negotiation, your very next conversation where your time or your skill has a price attached to it, whether that price is stated in dollars or simply in how much of your evening you're willing to give away for free. First, before you quote anything, decide what a person who is genuinely booked out for 6 months would charge for this exact work, and I want you to be honest that the number in your head right now is probably lower than that number, because almost everybody's default number has fear baked into it without them even noticing. Write both numbers down side by side if you have to. The gap between them is usually the exact size of the discount fear has been quietly applying to your worth for years. Second, deliver the higher number the way Curtis learned to deliver his. Flat, calm, without pre-apologizing, without rushing to fill the silence after you say it. Silence after a price is not rejection. It is simply the sound of somebody doing math, and the person who breaks that silence first by dropping their own number before anybody's even objected is the person who loses the exchange every single time, whether they realize it or not. Third, and this is the step that separates people who make this stick from people who try it once and retreat, treat the new number as your new floor, not a special occasion. Curtis's transformation didn't come from one brave estimate. It came from refusing to go back down after that one estimate worked, and then doing it again, and again, until the higher number simply became who he was in every room, not a performance he put on for one negotiation and then dropped the moment he felt nervous again. Fourth, understand that some people will say no to the higher number, and that is not proof the strategy failed. That is the strategy working exactly as intended. A person who is genuinely booked out for 6 months does not get every single job, and neither will you. The goal was never 100% yes. The goal is fewer jobs at a price that actually respects your time, because the math on that trade, as Curtis found out, almost always comes out dramatically in your favor, even when it feels, in the moment, like you're risking everything. Here's something else I want you to notice about this whole approach, the same way I've asked rooms to notice things before. Nobody around you can see the fear-based number you would have quoted instead. Your client doesn't know what you almost said. Your boss doesn't know what raise you almost didn't ask for. The version of you that stayed quiet, that discounted before anybody asked, that apologized for a fair price before a single objection was raised, that version is completely invisible, and so is the cost of choosing it, which is exactly why it's so easy to keep choosing it, year after year, without ever tallying up what it's actually taken from you. And understand the other side of this math too, because it's just as real as the $12,000 a year Curtis was leaving on the table for 9 straight years. Every time you hold a price instead of dropping it, every time you deliver a number the way somebody with options delivers a number, you're not just gaining that one job's extra margin. You are training the market around you, one interaction at a time, to treat your time the way you've decided it deserves to be treated. That training compounds exactly the same way the losses compound, except now it's working for you instead of against you, and within a few years, the higher number simply becomes the only number you've ever known, the same way Curtis eventually forgot what it felt like to apologize for his own price. So here's what I want you to do, starting with the very next quote, the very next ask, the very next moment somebody wants your time and you're about to name a number. Write down what you'd normally say. Then write down what a person genuinely booked out for 6 months would say for the exact same work. Deliver the second number. Deliver it flat, deliver it calm, and then stop talking, and let the silence do what silence always does, which is give the other person room to say yes. Most of you are not going to do this. I've given this talk enough times to know exactly how it plays out. Most people will hear this tonight, feel a flash of courage, maybe even rehearse the higher number in the car on the way home, and then walk into the next real conversation and quietly go back to the old number, because the old number feels safe, and safe has been winning against brave in most people's lives for as long as they can remember. That's their choice, and I understand it, because fear is a patient opponent and it never really goes away. It just waits for the next moment you're tired enough to listen to it. But some of you are going to hold the number the very next time it matters. Some of you are going to sit through that uncomfortable silence the way Curtis sat through it in his truck, and you're going to hear somebody say yes to a number you never would have had the nerve to say a year ago. And a few years from now, you and I are going to cross paths again, and you're going to tell me you stopped pricing like a person who needed the next job, and started pricing like a person who already had one. That's the whole message tonight, so don't let it slide past you the way you've let so many good ideas slide past you before. Charge like you're booked out for 6 months. Deliver the number flat, without apology, and let the silence work in your favor instead of rushing to fill it with a discount nobody even asked for. If tonight's message hit home, tell me in the comments the number you've been too afraid to quote. I read every single one of them, and I promise you're far from the only one carrying a number you've never had the nerve to say out loud. And if you want more of this kind of straight talk, the kind that changes how you actually show up in the rooms where your worth gets decided, subscribe to Legacy Mindset, because this is exactly the work we do here every single week. Now go quote the higher number.